So, today's meeting title is obviously, Is Zionism Finished? We are very honoured to have with us our speaker, Ilan Pappé. So Ilan obviously needs no introduction. He's an acclaimed anti-Zionist historian, one of the biggest historians taking on the lies of Zionism today, and he's the author of a number of crucial books, which we have available to buy at the bookmark stall just here and in the main bookshop, including The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, and many more. So just to quickly explain how the meeting will run, Ilan will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up with plenty of time for questions and discussion before we bring Ilan back at the end to sum up for us and answer any questions. So without further ado, Ilan Pappé.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to see you all here. Thank you for the introduction, and I will go directly into the topic. It is very difficult, especially in a gathering of a lot of people, to talk about anything but apart from how to stop the genocide in Gaza. As we speak, the genocide continues, and understandably, so many of us are focusing our energies, our efforts on how to stop the genocide as it continues. And yet, I think it is important, while doing it, of course, and keep thinking, is there anything else we can do that we haven't done, given the fact that the genocide continues? It is also important to look into a more distant future, to strategize, to realize or to ask ourselves, are there any processes, undercurrents that may show us that actually what we are experiencing today is the end of a bad chapter and not the beginning of one. History is usually cyclic and not linear. And we are undoubtedly, from the perspective of the people who live in historical Palestine, we are in the worst ever cycle in their history. But is that cycle near an end? My answer is yes. And I know it is irresponsible if I would have said, oh, don't worry, it's a matter of a month or even a year or two, and then you will see a dramatic change on the ground. No, unfortunately, as I say, this would be irresponsible. When we talk with our friends and comrades in Gaza, in the West Bank, inside Israel, we have to be careful not to make promises we cannot keep on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's very clear we cannot send them a message of despair or of hopelessness or helplessness, because they don't have the luxury for our despair and our lack of hope and belief that what we are doing is not only important, but also, in the end of the day, also effective. And what we are doing, even in the case of the genocide, has a cumulative effect. In fact, one of the reasons Israel chose the timing it chose for the attack on Iran was that finally, too late for many people, but nonetheless, it did happen, the discourse, the language of European leaders began to change. And that has to do a lot with the fantastic work of the Solidarity movement. And we should continue it because eventually it has an impact. It's not quick enough, it comes sometimes too late for many people, but nonetheless, it is effective. And yet, within this discussion about what to do to prevent tomorrow and the day after tomorrow for another 2 days of genocide, it is also good to talk about a more distant future and look at the processes that might make us all, especially the people of Palestine themselves, but all of us who are devoting our life and activism for Palestine as well. There are two kinds of processes in history that usually bring down projects such as Zionism. And we need to distinguish between the two processes. And this I'm saying on the basis of my study of history and not on the basis of my optimism as an activist. So it's part of the research that I and many others have been conducted for many years. One type of processes is the one on which we have very little impact. But we need to detect and recognize and acknowledge the existence of these processes. We have little impact on them, but they might have a great impact on us. There's a classical example from the case of the struggle against apartheid, South Africa. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, was not an objective of the ANC. But once it happened, it allowed the United States to join the sanction regime against the apartheid system, and that was an important factor, among other factors, of course, that brought down the apartheid regime. So these are the kinds of processes that are of the first type. The problem that if you only focus on these changes in history, of which you have very little relation with, they might create a new situation. They might bring down the Zionist regime. It's quite possible. But they can also create a chaos. They can create a vacuum. And we have around us, that is not around London, but around Palestine, we have examples of the collapse of regimes that was not followed by any substantial ideas of how to replace the collapsing state or regime, and that led to a very long period of violence, of bloodshed. So this is something we don't want. And here is where the second processes come into the discussion. Those we can impact. Those we have the power to be part of. And I think the most important role of these processes is to look at what I deem as an inevitable demise of the Zionist project, but making it not just a demise, but also the beginning of a much better period in the history of modern Palestine. I do think that this would begin not just a better future for the Palestinians, which is the most important thing. I really genuinely believe it's also a better future for the Jews who live in historical Palestine and the Jewish communities around the world as well. One thing we learn from history about either type of processes is that each one of them by themselves doesn't have the power to bring down a project like Zionism. But when they fuse together at a certain historical moment, they become a very powerful, transformative event. The other thing we learn from history is that they are very slow in making at the beginning. But when the collapse is occurring, they are very quick. Think about how South Vietnam disappeared in almost 3 weeks. Think about some other regimes that you know of in history, how quickly they collapsed at the end, at the very end. And also we know that the regimes that are disintegrating are most ruthless, are most cruel and callous at the last stages of their existence. This is also something we learn from history. And that explains the particular brutality of the Zionist regime in the last 20 months, which really is a different chapter given everything else that the Zionist movement in Israel inflicted on the Palestinians since the late 19th century. So let me very briefly, first of all, talk about the processes of collapse, of which none of us here has any impact. One is the implosion of the Israeli Jewish society from within. There are very clear indications that that society finds it very difficult to find a cement that would keep it together as an ethnic society, as a national society. And the reason is not the Palestinian resistance and is not our international solidarity movement. The reason is that the idea, that was good timing. The idea that Judaism is nationalism and not a religion is a false idea. And it took time for it to unfold as an impractical idea. But now it's very clear. If you take a religious identity and you claim that it is a national identity, it's not going to work. So now we have these, for the sake of simple reference, we have, if you want, the secular liberal Jews versus messianic, theocratic, more traditional Jewish section of society. And they really thought for many years that the existence of the so-called external enemy would keep them together. And then came the last 20 months and proved that that is not working either. In fact, the level of hatred and animosity between these two sections of society sometimes sometimes is far greater than the animosity that they display towards the Palestinians. And this disintegration from within, this implosion from within, is one very important, by no way the only one, indicator of the imminent collapse of the Zionist project. One particular group is taking over, the more messianic group, I called it recently the state of Judea. They are taking over Israel. They're already dominating the political system, the army, the secret service. The last bastion that they want to take over is the judicial system, but I believe that they would succeed in doing that as well. And in that respect, you will have a very clear message to the world: we are a fanatic, racist, messianic state. And in fact, if you read what they are talking about and what they are planning, their ambition goes far beyond the borders of historical Palestine, into the south of Syria, into the south of Lebanon. And these are people who would be in the possession of atomic bombs, a very strong air force, and yet would lack the social validity. They will not have the basis of a normal society. It would, in a way, be a group of militants with an army, but it would not be a group that has a viable state behind. Another process we have nothing to do with, but is working, is the economic crisis. Until recently, until the 7th of October 2023, Israel needed $3 billion a year from the United States to sustain its economy. In the last 20 months, it needed $14 billion to sustain it. And the bill will be doubled and tripled in years to come. And whatever we think, I know that we share the same ideas about the present political composition of the regime in the United States, they are not very happy about the idea of investing that much of that money in projects such as Zionism, especially when they have much better projects, unfortunately, in some of the Arab countries around Palestine. The third process, which I think is very important to take into account, is and then here I come more into things that we are part of, is the disassociation of so many young Jews around the world, particularly the United States, from Zionism and Israel. And so many of them believe that the best way to manifest their reasserting a Jewish identity that is not connected to Zionism is to be active in the solidarity movement with the Palestinians. Israel without a strong Jewish constituency in the world is a very weak country, and it's another process that adds to the collapse. There is also the issue of the army. I know it looks like an invisible army because of the way the Air Force performed in Iran, but let's explore this for a moment. What we have here is a military establishment that can win points, if you want, using Air Force. But the main problem from their own military perspective cannot be solved by Air Forces, cannot be solved by nuclear weapons. And when it came to facing small guerrilla movements, the smallest in the region, they were unable to defeat them. They were unable to find a way of wiping them out as they promised. And these movements are not going to go away. These movements are going to stay. And whatever the Air Force and the missiles bring with them, they don't bring a military solution that would wipe out Palestine as a nation, as a country, or as an idea. Now all this is happening, and in many ways the 7th of October was like an earthquake that shook a building that already had very extensive cracks in its foundation. That was the history who judged the 7th of October as a very powerful blow to an already a very shaky building. But as far as the processes that I think should make us also hopeful, not only because it is good news if we will see the weakening, the disintegration, who knows, even the collapse of the Zionist project, we fully understand that that can mean the liberation of Palestine and the Palestinians. But to make it connection, to make the connection between the collapse and liberation, there are certain processes we can be part of, and I will just mention a few of them. And I think we can be hopeful by thinking about them without, I keep reminding ourselves for one moment, stopping our relentless effort to stop the genocide in Gaza. One is something that none of us can do by ourselves, but it's very clear to all of us. I think we have been in this, I know some of the people here, we have been in the solidarity movement with the Palestinians for many, many years. We need a Palestinian position that is clear about decolonization, about the one-state solution, about the right of return, about the end of settler colonialism and its replacement with a democratic state. Looking at the present political parties that are composing the Palestinian political scene, they are disunited, they are fragmented, and it's very difficult to get any consensus position from them. However, we have to remember that the Palestinian people are one of the youngest in the world, in every constituency. And if you listen to the younger generation, to what they talk about, to what they envision, or envisage, what they are imagining as a future, it is very clear that unlike the present political leadership, they have a much more consensual view about the future. They have a much more, they are using a much clearer language, both to interpret the reality, but also what should replace the reality, whether it's decolonization, transitional justice, freedom, and liberation. The only issue there, and we've seen it in the attempted revolutions in the Arab world, 2011, 2012, young Palestinians and many young people around the world seem to have a healthy but impractical attitude towards trade unions, parties, organizations, and structures. They are worried that these kinds of vehicles of change, corruption. And they have some good reasons to believe that this is the case, given history. But you can't do this revolution without the trade unions. You cannot do the revolution without movements, without parties. You need organization. And whether it is a new PLO, a different organization, of course, that's up to the Palestinians. Because one of the most important things that we are facing is not just the genocide. We are facing the language of the day after. That already you can hear it, people talking about the reconstruction of Gaza, the day after, bringing the PA into Gaza, and so on. This is the language of the past. This is the language of the so-called peace process that produced the 7th of October and will happen after the 7th of October. If we look at what was the most common feature of the so-called genuine or cynical peace efforts, the most important feature was that the Palestinians were never consulted about what they want. It's quite incredible. From the Balfour Declaration until today, peace in the eyes of the Western diplomats and politicians and mainstream journalists, peace is an Israeli, usually an American Israeli, sometimes a Norwegian Israeli, sometimes a European Israeli, it doesn't matter, idea of peace, and you want the Palestinians to react to that idea. This all, of course, has to change. So we need to hear what some Palestinian ideas and opinions, so that everyone else would first of all recognize that they are the ones in the driver's seat, and everyone else would react to this, and then you can have a genuine decolonization process, because you will need a decolonization process because of the collapse. Well, I was ideal as an imminent collapse of the settler colonial project. And some of these questions really can only be answered by a national liberation movement. For instance, whether we like it or not, in the future there will still be millions of Jews between the river and the sea. Usually the whole conversation in the past was, what do the Israelis offer the Palestinians? It's time to ask, what do the Palestinians offer to the Jews who live together between the river and the sea? The timing is not very good for such a conversation after the genocide. No doubt. People in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip tell me we don't want even to imagine living together with these people. Not just because of what the government did, but because of the huge support that the government has for the genocide. Understandable. But sometimes you have to be also practical and not just emotional. And you don't have to be just moral, you have also to be pragmatic. So this is a question to be asked. As there should be asked the question, how would the right of return be implemented? Not whether the right of return is a precondition for decolonization. Of course it is. But how would it be implemented? What is the meaning of transitional justice in the case of Palestine? What will be the future not of the small settlements in the West Bank, but the big cities that Israel built after 1967? How do they differ from the big cities that the Zionist movement built in 1948? Now, I'm not giving you the answer to these questions, I'm posing this. What I'm really encouraged by is that I already am able to write a book, which will appear in October, based on answers already given by Palestinians to these questions. That makes me very hopeful, mostly by young Palestinians. There's a huge Palestinian human capital around the world that in normal circumstances would have been invested in historical Palestine itself, but because of Zionism and colonization was invested elsewhere. But now it is reinvested in Palestine and its future. For so many years, young Palestinians were not always interested in Palestine and its future. But this has changed. And this has produced a very rich literature and knowledge that gives us a very good idea and where Palestine can go once these other processes I was talking about would mature and create this kind of conducive circumstances for building a liberated Palestine led by the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. And what you hear is a very clear idea that whatever you are looking for as a way forward, you are not searching the way forward in the European supermarket of ideas, which is what the previous peace process was built on. You are searching for it in your own history, in your own heritage, in your own legacy. This is something that also the left would have to digest and accept. It requires us to rethink our attitude towards tradition, towards religion, towards the era of history before the arrival of Zionism and imperialism and colonialism to the Arab world in general, but to the Eastern Mediterranean in particular, what in Arabic we call the Mashriq. Because if you look at that particular part of the Arab world, before the arrival of Zionism, before the arrival of colonialism, it was a mosaic of identities, of a genuine coexistence between ethno-cultural groups, and that's what the Jews of Israel would have to accept, willingly or unwillingly, it doesn't matter, that Judaism can be an identity of an ethno-cultural group. It cannot be a national identity. It definitely cannot be the identity of a Jewish nation state. And that means reintegrating, and that's what comes out from all this information that I'm gathering, reintegrating Palestine into the Arab world. What Israel and Europe did from the very inception of the Zionist project was to decide that because Europe cannot deal with anti-Semitism in the late 19th century and up to the end of the Second World War, the best solution is to build a European Jewish state at the heart of the Arab world, at the heart of the Muslim world, at the expense of the Palestinians. And therefore, both European politicians and intellectuals and academics and Israelis believe that geographically, Palestine is not part of the Arab world. Whether it's through Eurovision, European football, whatever. But Palestine is part of the Arab world. And it would be the only way of moving forward is reintegrating it to the Arab world, as it used to be, where people moved freely, where ideas moved freely, where culture thrived because it was organically inspired by Beirut, Baghdad, Damascus, Jaffa, Haifa. There was no distinction in this respect for the ability of people to produce ideas that push forward their society for having better life and a much more improved future. A process that Zionism and colonialism disrupted brutally in the case of Palestine. Villages where, in Palestine, where Jews, Muslim and Christian live together are now segregated. Cities that were a mosaic of identities became purely Jewish as a result of these processes. So to sum up this, I think it's important to realize that while we are not expecting, and rightly so, for people who are daily struggling just to survive under genocide in the Gaza Strip or ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, we all can be part of strategizing beyond tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. We all have a clear role in it, whether we are part of the movement, whether we are part of the solidarity with the movement. It is both a hopeful conversation, but it's really a necessary one. And I will finish with one idea, and this will be really my last point. I don't know of any successful revolution in history that reached what most people would agree was a moment of triumph without imagination. You need imagination. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to the Palestinians to imagine a Palestine where everyone is free from the river to the sea, where refugees have returned, where the Palestinians can reconnect to their heritage, to the region, to their history, and where they can return to what they always wanted, which is normal, natural life, and then deal with all the other problems each society needs. And finally, using this imagination, to my mind, is the best antidote to the lack of imagination, the lack of moral constitution, the lack of moral standing that our politicians display. They are of very low caliber these days. They are self-centered. They believe that politics is a profession, not a mission. And that's one of the reasons for the incomprehensible difference that they have shown with genocide in Gaza. We should answer it and challenge it, both by moral courage, but also by believing through imagination that the Palestinian suffering for 120 years not only is coming to an end, but is being replaced by a new cycle of history of freedom, equality, and liberation. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for your comments and questions. Of course, I won't be able to answer all of them, but I hope I'm able to respond to most of them. Let me start by talking about the Israeli working class. I think it's a good entry point to the rest of the questions that was raised here. The first thing we know about the Israeli working class that most of them don't have dual nationality. It's important to say that. And most of them come originally from an Arab country or a Muslim country, not a European country. And it's very sad, of course, that this population, which is nearly 50% of the Jewish population of Israel, is now mostly led by political leaders, religious leaders, traditional leaders, are very racist, are very anti-Arab, self-hating themselves in a way, denying their own Arab ethnicity. And the left, the anti-Zionist left in Israel, in fact, the Communist Party, for years hoped to build on the basis of working class identity, some solidarity with the Palestinians, because this is a group of Jews who were brought from the Arab and Muslim world and were discriminated against in Israel, still are in many ways, are pushed to the social and geographical margin of the Israeli society. But because they are Arabs, there's also a potential for hope here, both because they are working class, but also because of their connection to the region. But it's very difficult to see how it's going to be done that. But part of imagining and talking about decolonization is not being happy with sound bites and slogans. That's what I was trying to say. It needs hard work. It needs hard work. It's not enough to shout morally just ideas. They have to be unpacked into program, into hard work. And I'm so happy to say that this hard work is being done. It's being done. We don't see it. We don't look at it now, understandably, because our focus, rightly so, is on the genocide and stopping it. But I'm saying this started before the 7th of October and would continue and should be part, I think, of the international solidarity movement's package when you discuss with people who are not part of the international solidarity movement, to make sure that they understand that there is a different way from the one that has been chosen by their own governments. by their own people who genuinely or cynically are involved in the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that's the first point I would like to make. The second point is about decolonization in general. I don't know of any case in decolonization in history that was a nice walk in the park. It's a messy business. Decolonization of a project of 120 years that created an organic state is not going to happen in a day, and is not going to be unpacked without understanding the mechanism that keep it together and disintegrate it. And I do think that it's absolutely clear to me and to anyone here that when one of the questions, and it's only one of the questions, that are being discussed about the future is the future of the millions of Jews who live now in Israel. As I say, it's not the only question. It is very clear that this is not a wait for their acceptance of decolonization. It is not a precondition for liberation, but it can be a very helpful part of decolonization. And therefore, ideas that were mentioned here, I myself do not subscribe to them, but I'm very happy to hear other ideas, of course. And anyway, as I said, this is really the decision of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. And for that, we haven't mentioned, because there's no time to go into many other things, we need to reintegrate the 48 Arabs into the Palestinian discussion. These are those who don't know, these are the Palestinian citizens of Israel, 2 million of them. Their politicians decided to play only in the Israeli political field. We need to ask them to play in the Palestinian political field. They are probably the only Palestinians who know the Israeli Jews, not just as soldiers and settlers. And that is also creating. This is not for the sake of recognizing the rights of the Zionist colonization. This is for the sake of making sure, as Franz Fanon always warned us, that you don't create a new state through violence, because then it becomes part of the DNA of the state. We have so many examples for it in post-colonial Africa, post-colonial South America, and post-colonial Southeast Asia. Palestine deserves to have a different kind of future. That's the reason I'm focusing on it, not because it's a precondition. Will most of the Jews be de-Zionized in this process? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I have no idea. I know it is not a precondition. I agree that those with dual nationality, those with jobs they can reignite elsewhere, might not want to live in a society which is not an apartheid state. But it's difficult to predict. What I do remember is visiting South Africa in 2014, and every white person I met told me they were against apartheid. So I said, if you were all against apartheid, why it took so long to bring it down? In my imagination, and I'm judging it by my father-in-law who's nearly 100, he begins to talk in a non-Zionist discourse. I don't know if it's dementia. I hope it's not. I think that he begins to understand the reality. I think he begins to understand the reality. So I'm hopeful about that as well. But that definitely is not the case. 2 points, 3 more points that were important. One is about how can you be hopeful given my own analysis and your own analysis of how brutal, how ruthless, how racist is the present Israeli government and political elite. But that's the irony of history, and that's where our role as a solidarity movement comes into play. Because it is so ruthless, because it is so cruel, because it has no respect whatsoever for any humanity, international law, and so on, it exposes itself far more for what it is when compared to the time when it was ruled by liberal Zionists, so to speak, and you could have been mistaken to think that this is a different kind of a project. It was always a project of dispossession. It was always a project of the elimination of the native. That hasn't changed from 1882 until today, but it was packaged in a different way. They don't bother to package it in a different way. On the one hand, it's frightening and you can see the damage that it can inflict. On the other hand, it should be easier to expose it for what it is and maybe expand our solidarity movement to include also people who were not there before. We know, unfortunately, I'm sure you felt it yourself among your friends and neighbors, so many people who were never part of the solidarity movement joined us in the last 20 months. It is very sad that they joined us because of what they have seen on their television. On the other hand, this is life, and we have to understand it, and that's what's going on. Compared to the 1970s, when the solidarity movement of the Palestinians was very small, very specific, this is now a mass movement. A mass movement that probably needs to find a way, and I agree, find the way which already is in the conscience of people, that their struggle for their own injustices is a struggle against injustice in Palestine. How do we turn the million of people who demonstrated in London into a political movement that doesn't only fight against Zionism in Palestine, but against injustice in Britain? That's the question. And they are connected. They are connected. Because the crisis of politics, the essence of politics, this gap between the political elite's way of viewing us and our own interest, the gap is still very wide, and any narrowing of that gap will bring Palestine closer to liberation and freedom. Finally, and with this, I would end, and again, I apologize if I don't remember all the very, very important points that were mentioned here. For me, it's very clear that in the world, Palestine, and in particular Gaza, that is what's so impressive about Gaza. When you see the satellite pictures of Gaza, you would say anybody who would saw the picture would not believe that you can still say that Palestine's heart is in that place that is totally destroyed. The resilience, the resistance of these people, incredible. It's incredible, and I think it inspires Palestine as a whole. Gaza and Palestine are now at the center of two global alliances, not because Palestine and Gaza is the only issue of injustice in the world, not because what's happening there is the only place that deserves our attention as human beings, as socialists, as people of the left, and so on. Because it represents so many other injustices. And we are really facing two global alliances. Global Israel. Global Israel is very important because it began as an idea that was relatively limited. It was global West, if you want. Namely, you had the Christian Zionists, you had Anglo-Jewish aristocrats, you had imperialists, you had capitalists. For their own reason, they decided that the idea the Jews cannot be integrated in Europe opens up new opportunities to expand the British Empire into the Middle East, for some Christian Zionists to get back the only Jew they wanted, Jesus Christ, if you don't understand, and other kinds of agendas were playing, but that was very small. All that was needed for maintaining Zionism as part of the British mandate. But today, to maintain Israel as a kind of mini empire of high-tech, of military presence, it was not enough to have that alliance. Now the alliance is much bigger. It's from the Indian Prime Minister to Christian Zionists in Scandinavia, security service, securitization industries, capitalists, neo-capitalists. There is a global Israel. It's an elite business. It's an elite project. It's very powerful, and it lacks, of course, any moral constitution, but it sustained the Zionist state. But there is a global Palestine. And as I mentioned before, I don't think global Palestine was ever as big as it is today. And we have to believe that that global Palestine that includes nowadays, like never before, indigenous people all over the world, trade unions, workers, anyone with a modicum of decency who feels that politics is not a way of life that addresses their concerns is part of global Palestine, either directly or indirectly. It's incomprehensible and unacceptable that we should think that such a movement of millions and millions of people cannot bring down a regime of apartheid and oppression and dispossession. We should believe that this is possible. We should believe that this is possible not only in the case of Palestine, but in a case wherever human rights and civil rights are being daily violated by regimes. One thing we have, I'm sure we have, and this is my last sentence, we can be more sophisticated than our politicians. It's not that difficult. You can condemn the violation of human rights and civil rights by the Iranian regime and totally condemn the Zionist attack on Iran. The idea of British politicians that you have to decide between the two is incredible, and you're thinking about the level of intelligence that is involved in not being able to make such a sentence, to compose such a sentence. Really, we can totally condemn the violation of human rights and civil rights in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, and at the same time say that there is time to end the Zionist project in Palestine. The two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are part of a humanist message that the left has always had, and we should succeed. Thank you.